We are living through seismic shifts in global politics. In the 1990s, the world was dominated by one major power, the United States, which could impose its will on most countries on Earth, largely because there was no more counterbalance to US dominance. The former Soviet Union was overthrown, and the US was the only game in town. This was known as the unipolar moment. The US was the unipolar power in the world. However, it was always clear that that moment would not last forever. If you fast forward to the 2020s, it is now clear as day to everyone that the world is multipolar. The US is no longer the only dominant power. This is now so uncontroversial that the Munich Security Conference published a 2025 annual report titled Multipolarization. This report stated clearly that, quote, the world's multipolarization is a fact, end quote. However, it also made it clear that what this multipolar world will look like is not clear because the current international system shows elements of unipolarity, bipolarity with two powers, multipolarity, and non-polarity, in which multiple order models coexist, compete, or clash. And I think this point is very important because now everyone agrees that we're in a multipolar world, but a lot of people don't agree on what they mean by multipolar. And today I'm going to talk about how the definition used by the United States, specifically by the Donald Trump administration, is totally different from the idea of multipolarity advocated by many global South countries, especially by China. Because when China talks about multipolarity, they mean a world without imperialism and without hegemony, in which all countries have an equal voice in multilateral institutions and all governments are allowed to pursue their own independent path of development without foreign intervention. This is very different. This is the opposite of what the United States means by multipolarity. When US Secretary of State Marco Rubio talks about multipolarity, and I'll show clips of Marco Rubio later on in this analysis today, when Rubio and Donald Trump talk about multipolarity, what they mean is that now there are other great powers that challenge US dominance, and the US must reimpose its imperial sphere of influence on the Western Hemisphere.
We do have near-peer adversaries. We didn't 25 years ago. The United States lived in a unipolar world where we were the only show in town. Now there are at least one unprecedented near-peer adversary. The Chinese Communist Party is a challenge to the United States, unlike greater even than what the Soviet Union was, because they are a commercial rival, a technological rival, a geopolitical rival, a diplomatic rival, and a commercial one. And in addition to all of that, they are also a military threat to the country as they continue to develop.
They see the multipolar world as a world in which the US empire has its own sphere of influence. This is why the Trump administration is very aggressive in Latin America, threatening Mexico, threatening Panama, trying to take back the Panama Canal, threatening Colombia, threatening Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. This is why Trump wants to colonize Greenland. This is why Trump is even threatening Canada and saying he wants to make it the 51st state. All of this is about imposing US hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. This is why the Trump administration is invoking the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine that says that the US empire controls Latin America, that it's the so-called backyard of the US empire. And what the Trump administration is saying is that China and Russia are not allowed to have relations with countries in Latin America or in the Western Hemisphere in general, because in their false view of multipolarity, they think a multipolar world means one of inter-imperialist rivalries in which the US is an empire competing with other empires. But many other governments don't share that same view. China has made it very clear that it does not want to create an empire and then challenge the US empire and have multiple empires in a multipolar world. When China talks about multipolarity, its definition means a world without imperialism and without hegemony. And this is a definition that is shared by many countries in the global South and in BRICS. So when South Africa and Brazil, when they talk about multipolarity, they mean a world without hegemony and without imperialism. Now, if you don't believe me, I'm going to read quotes from a speech that was given by China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, at the Munich Security Conference in February 2025. He said, "A multipolar world is not only a historical inevitability, it is also becoming a reality." But he asked, will multipolarity bring chaos, conflict, and confrontation? Does it mean domination by major countries and the strong bullying the weak? China's answer is we should work for an equal and orderly multipolar world, end quote. And then he said China's understanding of a multipolar world is one with equal treatment for all countries. He criticized the idea of rivalry between big powers, saying it has brought disaster to humanity. So this is the US view, the view of Trump and Marco Rubio. When they say multipolar, they mean rivalry between big powers. But China criticizes what it calls the colonial system and the core periphery structure. China said these unequal orders are bound to meet their demise. China said a multipolar world is one based on independence and autonomy with greater democracy in international relations. So China is saying that international institutions should not simply be dominated by a small handful of great powers. This is why China has called for making international institutions like the United Nations more representative, having a greater participation of global South countries. As China's foreign minister Wang Yi put it, quote, "Equal rights, equal opportunities, and equal rules should become the basic principles of a multipolar world," end quote. He added, quote, "China advocates equality among all countries regardless of size and calls for increasing the representation and say of developing countries in the international system," end quote. This is the total opposite of what Donald Trump and Marco Rubio mean. Trump wants to colonize the Panama Canal. He wants to colonize Greenland. He wants to invade Mexico, to impose control on Mexico. He's talking about making Canada the 51st state. Trump's view of multipolarity is inter-imperialist rivalry. China's view of multipolarity is a world without imperialism and without hegemony. This viewpoint is very clear if you listen to an interview that Trump Secretary of State Marco Rubio did in January with the conservative talk show host Megyn Kelly. Now, I need to stress that Marco Rubio is a neoconservative. He is the king of the neocons. He has strongly supported every single U.S. war. But in this interview, Marco Rubio acknowledged that we're in a multipolar world. And some people took those comments out of context and claimed that Marco Rubio is moving away from neoconservatism because he recognizes that the US is no longer the only dominant power in the world. But that completely misunderstands what Marco Rubio is saying. Rubio does not mean multipolarity in the way that China means it. Rubio means that we're going back to a world of inter-imperialist rivalry, and the US can no longer control the entire world. So instead, Rubio argues that the US empire should maintain control over its imperial sphere of influence, which is the Western Hemisphere, and especially Latin America. So listen closely here to Marco Rubio's comments acknowledging that we're in a multipolar world. You'll see that immediately after, he fearmongers about China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was the product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent, Russia. And then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with.
If you listen to the rest of the interview that Rubio did, and don't just take that one comment about the multipolar world out of context, you can see that Rubio spent most of the interview fear-mongering about China. He mentioned the words China or Chinese 65 times in this interview, constantly fear-mongering and saying that the US empire must challenge Chinese influence all around the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. And when he was asked about Greenland, Donald Trump wants to colonize Greenland. What was his response? He said the Arctic region is becoming more and more critical and its shipping lanes are vital He said, the Arctic is some of the most valuable shipping lanes in the world. And as ice is melting due to climate change being exacerbated by Trump's drill baby drill policies, he's saying that there's going to be more and more possibilities to navigate the Arctic, this area, and the U.S. needs to turn Greenland into a giant base, a U.S. military base. They already have one there, but to expand it to prevent China from accessing the Arctic. That's what he said in the interview. This is his view of multipolarity, that the U.S. needs to prevent China from getting access to the Arctic and the Western Hemisphere. This is not a multipolarity of anti-imperialism, which is what China and the global South means when they talk about multipolarity. This is a pro-imperialist view of multipolarity. Here's another example. Listen to this clip in the same interview with Megyn Kelly, in which Rubio complains that China wants to be the most powerful country and the U.S. must stop China.
And, China wants to be the most powerful country in the world, and they want to do so at our expense. And that's not in our national interest, and we're going to address it.
So the point that I'm getting at here is that there are some Trump supporters out there who claim that Trump is taking on the deep state and challenging the neocons. And they claim that even though Donald Trump chose neocons to run his foreign policy, including the neoconservative National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, including the neoconservative Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and including the king of the neocons Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, they say, Trump supporters say, oh, well, Rubio has abandoned his neoconservative past, and now he's a foreign policy realist. And listen to his comment about the world being multipolar. But they took that one comment out of context and ignored the rest of the interview, in which he fearmongered about China 65 times in one interview. So Marco Rubio has not changed his neoconservative worldview. Some neoconservatives like Rubio have rebranded themselves as pro-Trump Republicans and nationalists, but they still have the same worldview, which is that the U.S. empire should impose its dominance to maximize the power of the U.S. empire. I mean, Trump himself said that in his inauguration speech. He said, we're going to expand the power of the U.S. empire and expand the territory of the United States. And he even invoked the colonialist idea of manifest destiny, which is blatantly imperialist.
And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars.
This is why Trump is basically saying he doesn't care about Ukraine, because essentially his worldview is that Eastern Europe is not part of the U.S. imperial sphere of influence. Trump and Marco Rubio see the world like 19th century colonialists, that every great power has an imperial sphere of influence, and they think that China is just as imperialist as the United States, even though it's not at all. The Chinese system is completely different than the U.S. system. China has a socialist system based on cooperation internationally, what they refer to as win-win cooperation and mutually beneficial development. And China's foreign policy is not driven by corporations trying to maximize their profit and billionaire oligarchs trying to suck out the wealth of global South countries. Whereas U.S. foreign policy is the opposite. It's driven by big corporations on Wall Street and Silicon Valley, big monopolies. It's driven by big capitalist oligarchs like Elon Musk, who's basically the unelected de facto co-president of the US. And US foreign policy is the opposite of the win-win cooperation advocated by China. US foreign policy is a zero-sum game. Trump's worldview is that the US must win and everyone else must lose. US corporations must maximize their profits and exploit the rest of the world. These ideologies, these systems are complete opposites. China's socialist system and the US capitalist system are opposites, and that's why it's no surprise that Chinese foreign policy and US foreign policy are opposites. And it's also why it's no surprise that when China talks about a multipolar world and the US talks about a multipolar world, they are opposites. Now, I have closely followed the speeches that Marco Rubio has been giving for years, and it is simply not true that Rubio has abandoned his neoconservative views. He's using many of the same talking points today in 2025 that he has been using for years. As an example, I want to play some clips of a Senate hearing that Marco Rubio participated in back in 2022, before he was in the Trump administration. This is back in the Biden administration. This was a Senate hearing fear-mongering about China's growing global influence. And in this committee hearing, for which Marco Rubio was the vice chairman, he complained that China is trying to displace the U.S. as the world's most powerful country.
We often talk about China's plans and intentions behind closed doors, but the fact of the matter is that their ultimate goal and what they're trying to do is really not that big a secret. They seek to displace the United States and to become the world's most dominant economic, industrial, technical, and military and geopolitical power. That's their goal.
Then, in this 2022 Senate hearing, Rubio complained that the U.S. thought that it could change China's system and force China to become more like the United States. They wanted China to adopt capitalism and to adopt a U.S. style of bourgeois so-called democracy in which rich people can buy elections by funding the campaigns of politicians from all parties. But Rubio complained that China did not become like the U.S. and still maintains its own unique socialist system, which he's furious about.
In this country for a long time, had this hope for the better part of 20 years, this consensus really, that once the Chinese Communist Party in that country became rich, it would become more like us. Well, obviously that's not materialized.
Then Rubio complained that the rise of China is the largest challenge ever faced by the United States. And he said that China is even more of a so-called threat than the former Soviet Union, because whereas the USSR was a military so-called threat to the US, which it actually never was, it never wanted a war with the US. But the point is he argues that China is more of a so-called threat because China is even stronger economically and technologically than the Soviet Union ever was.
The intelligence community, I think at this point leaders on both sides of the aisle have been pretty clear that this is the single greatest challenge this nation has ever faced. We have never faced a near-peer adversary that poses such a comprehensive challenge the way that China does today. Soviet Union was a military and a geopolitical rival. They were never an industrial, a technical, or commercial rival. China is all of that and more.
So this explains why Rubio in the past few years has been trying to rebrand himself as a right-wing so-called populist. It's all about the new Cold War on China. It's about maximizing U.S. imperial power and trying to weaken and destabilize China. And eventually he wants to overthrow the Communist Party of China and overthrow the unique Chinese socialist system. And in this Senate hearing, he made it clear why Rubio has been advocating for protectionist economic policies and a return to industrial policy in the U.S. because he's concerned that the U.S. has become dependent on a global supply chain in which China plays a key role, that the U.S. has deindustrialized due to the neoliberal free market policies in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that led to the financialization and deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, while China became the world's industrial superpower. Rubio is saying that we have to reindustrialize, we have to abandon free trade and become protectionist in order to weaken China, because the U.S. cannot be dependent on China. This is not about the working class. He doesn't care about the working class at all. He's always been a right-wing Republican funded by billionaires and big corporations. All of this is about containing China, about weakening China and maximizing U.S. imperial power.
And so they know that once we are dependent on them, our manufacturing base, our supply chains, critical minerals, and not to mention dangling the promise of access to their massive market, well, then our options will be limited and their leverage will be extraordinary. If we think having supply chain disruptions as a result of a pandemic shutting down some factories has been bad for our economy, imagine it being shut down deliberately as leverage against us in a time of future conflict, because that's what we can expect to see, and it leaves us vulnerable into something we need to begin to address.
Those were comments that Rubio made in 2022. If you listen to those comments and compare them to what he's saying now as Secretary of State in the interview he did with Megyn Kelly in January 2025, they're the same comments. He hasn't suddenly changed and abandoned his neoconservative views. He's been rebranding over years. This is what the new form of neoconservatism looks like. It uses populist rhetoric. It says we need the US to reindustrialize and return to protectionism, all in order to try to weaken China. So when Rubio talks about the multipolar world, it is the opposite of the way that China talks about a multipolar world. Even though they're using the same words, they have completely different meanings. And the same is true for many other leaders in the Global South. I want to briefly look at a few speeches that were given by Nicaragua's revolutionary president, Daniel Ortega, who is the leader of the Sandinista revolution. And he, for years, has been talking about the increasing multipolarity in the world. But when Nicaragua talks about multipolarity, they mean it in the way that China means it. So this is a speech that was given by Nicaragua's president, Daniel Ortega. He said, "We are seeing explosions in the world that are, quote, part of a birth. A new order is being born in the world that buries imperialism, buries the colonialists, and opens the way to a democracy of nations, a multipolarism that is manifesting itself in various ways. We see the initiatives emerging in different spaces, and on the other hand, we see North American imperialism trying to maintain its hegemony at all costs, even at the risk of sinking its own economy," end quote. He's referring to the move back toward tariffs and sanctions and how that can backfire and boomerang on the US economy. But here you can see that when Nicaragua, when the Sandinistas talk about multipolarity, they mean it in the Chinese sense of a world beyond imperialism, beyond hegemony, whereas Marco Rubio and Trump mean a world in which the US is not the only imperial power, but has to compete with other great powers. Here's another example of a speech that President Ortega gave in 2022 on the anniversary of the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. He said the US-led West and NATO were waging a war that, quote, "the empires have started to try to destroy the struggle that humanity is carrying out to bring about the end of hegemony and to create multipolarity on our planet," end quote. He then condemned the, quote, "powers that colonized Africa, Asia, Latin America," end quote. And he said that those colonial powers were trying to stop the world from becoming multipolar. So this is why I wanted to create this analysis today, to explain to people that when the US talks about multipolarity and when China and Nicaragua and many global South countries with anti-imperialist governments talk about multipolarity, even though they're using the same word, it means the complete opposite. So it's very important to actually explain what you mean, to define what you mean by a multipolar world. Because if you don't, people are going to be very confused about what's happening today in global politics. If you like the work that we do talking about the increasing growth of multipolarity in the world and how the formerly colonized countries of the global South have been economically developing and challenging the hegemony of the US-led West, well, you should continue to follow our work here at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.